Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. Happy New Year to all our Drumbeats listeners. Rob and I want to start 2026 by doing something a little bit different. But before we look at what's ahead this year, we thought we'd take a moment to talk about a Canadian tradition that's quite relevant to this day, the levée.
Right. And Mark, and Happy New Year to everybody and all our listeners. The levée, as you mentioned, is one of those traditions that not everyone knows about, but it's been part of Canadian culture for a long time. It's a tradition that connects to government, military, and Indigenous communities. So it felt like the right way to begin this episode.
And then after that, we're going to take you through some of the standout guest conversations we had in 2025 and what a year it was. So we're calling this episode The Best of Drumbeats 2025. A look back at the people and organizations who shaped the conversation around the Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit in the past year.
And then we'll wrap up with a few thoughts on what's ahead for 2026. So let's start with the levée.
The levée tradition in Canada goes back farther than most people realize. The very first levée in what would become Canada was held in 1606 by Samuel de Champlain at Port Royal.
And now Annapolis Royal in Nova Scotia. The first levée took place on New Year's Day, 1 January 1606. And a Mi'kmaq chief from Membertou attended that first levée, making Indigenous participation part of the tradition from the very beginning. The word levée comes from the French verb lever, or levée, meaning to rise, referring to the practice of receiving visitors upon waking. It was a gathering where the community came together to mark the new year.
And what's significant is this wasn't just a European tradition transplanted to Canada. From that first gathering in 1606, as you mentioned, Indigenous leaders were present. It's about building relationships, showing respect, and marking important moments together. And I think it's so fitting with what we learned over the past year, Rob, that Chief Membertou's presence at the first levée established a precedent for Indigenous participation across all walks of life, as we learned. Over the century, the tradition has evolved through military and government institutions. Governor General, Lieutenant Governors, and military commanders held levees at open-door receptions. And in recent years, some Indigenous nations have reclaimed and reinterpreted the tradition, hosting their own levée, sovereignty and cultural presence. And I just have to mention, I really grew up with this because my father, Rob, as you know, is a retired lieutenant colonel. So, New Year's Day was definitely a levée at the officers' mess and gathering. That was part of life. And when it came to the UK, it was like, well, they don't have a levée on New Year's Day. So on this New Year's Day, as we reflect on the year that was and look ahead, it feels fitting to acknowledge that tradition and what it represents: gathering, relationship building, and moving forward together. And that's been at the heart of the conversations we've had on Drumbeats since we started, Rob, in 2024, continued in this past year.
Absolutely right, Mark. With that in mind, let's move into the heart of this episode, the best conversations we had in 2025.
2025 was a remarkable year for the Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit. We had the privilege of speaking with some of the most influential leaders in the space. People are building the infrastructure, creating the partnerships, and changing the way capital flows into Indigenous communities. And these weren't just conversation. They were insight into how the landscape is actually changing and how doing business in Canada is changing. Each guest brought lived experience, specific knowledge, and a clear sense of where things were heading. It was really exciting. So we've selected the top 10 guest episodes based on audience engagement and what resonated most with our listeners, because every one of our conversations was exciting.
Yes, and what you're about to hear are highlights from those conversations. We've kept them brief, but each one captures a key moment or insight that we think is worth revisiting as we head into 2026.
Here's Clint Davis, CEO of Cedarleaf Capital, who explains how it became the first Indigenous majority-owned investment dealer in Canada, supported throughout the process by Scotiabank.
It actually started about two and a half years ago. And it was a pull from the market. So it wasn't coming from the Indigenous business leadership at the time or from one of the major financial institutions or anything of that nature, but it was a major resource company in Canada, and they were issuing securities bonds in the United States. And in the US, you actually have a really quite a decent, growing, robust ecosystem of investment dealers that have unique ownership. And so that ownership represents minorities from African American, Latino American, and tribal, as well as women, veterans, people with disabilities. And so these are investment dealers that bring a unique perspective to syndicates, as well as opening up new avenues for investors. And so many of the companies that, or Canadian companies that actually issue in the United States, have used these minority dealers. And so this resource company asked the question as to whether or not anything like that existed in Canada. And if so, if it was Indigenous, that they would give serious consideration to working with that company. And so that was expressed to Scotiabank. And so Scotiabank did some research, realized very quickly that, in fact, there wasn't any type of dealer that had that unique ownership. And they thought to themselves that what we should be looking at is in alignment with reconciliation, that we should stand one up so that we can provide it with the necessary footing, foundation, and so that ultimately you'd have a 100% Indigenous owned and controlled investment dealer.
Next up is Matt Smith, who was at the time CEO of the Saskatchewan Indigenous Investment Finance Corporation. He discusses how their loan guarantee addresses long-standing barriers to Indigenous access to capital.
So SIFC, we kind of alternate between calling it SIFC and SIFC, but it kind of came about. I would say the government of Saskatchewan recognized that existing barriers to access to capital for Indigenous people in the province were really preventing them from, yielding the full benefits of some of the projects that were occurring here in the province. And so in about 2021, 2022, we began work on exploring what the opportunities were to support increased access to capital for Indigenous communities in the province through kind of some research and conversations and leadership from 6 Indigenous business leaders from Saskatchewan who helped guide us through that process. We kind of identified the loan guarantees or loan guarantee program being probably the best fit to help support that increased participation. We received a lot of advice and support from our friends to the west in Alberta, from the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, who were really kind of the front runner in this space. And Shannon and her team continue to be just really great, mentors and resources and supporters of us. So we're very fortunate in that space. So just as a bit of background, Indigenous people for, a broad range of reasons, but, particularly through the Indian Act and some other legislation, aren't able to utilize any of their kind of assets as collateral for investments. And as a result, they've had challenges accessing capital, or in instances where they can access capital, the rates are really non-competitive and really impact the overall viability of the investment, or certainly drastically reduce the potential returns from those investment. A loan guarantee from the government of Saskatchewan with the province's AA credit rating really not only allows Indigenous communities to access capital, but really much more competitively priced and competitive capital that helps more money go back to the community for them to utilize in their priorities.
We have the Honorable Greg Rickford talk about Ontario's Ring of Fire and how it is emerging as Canada's new critical minerals frontier.
Ontario has a massive profile in base metals and critical minerals. The Ring of Fire in particular is an exquisite, quantitatively and qualitatively deposit, plural, of the lion's share of what we categorically refer to as critical minerals. But you also have to have some baseline capacity when you talk about the Ring of Fire. And Ontario has that in spades. We have obviously the Sudbury Basin, which is a world-class and caliber nickel deposits, amongst other things. We have other critical mineral deposits in other parts of Northern Ontario, particularly in Northwestern Ontario, with lithium coming on board. But the Ring of Fire is located some 400 to 500 kilometers north of the last highway, if you will. Think of it as a corridor from Toronto to Montreal, but through, one of the James Bay lowlands, a world-renowned carbon sink. Mm-hmm. And frankly, as somebody who has lived there for extended periods of time, obviously not my life, but working up north in many of the communities proximal to the Ring of Fire as a nurse, I have a deep appreciation for the land and the relationship that Indigenous peoples have with it. And so we want to be very careful in its development, but we've taken a decidedly different approach than previous governments and really invested in First Nations leadership, especially when it comes to the environmental assessments. They're nearly completed. And the Corridor to Prosperity, as I had named it a number of years ago, I think we're hopeful that we can start that fairly soon. In some respects, we already have, because we're developing what we call the Greenstone area. It's a large municipality that sits at the base of just off the Trans-Canada, ultimately form, a major corridor that has to be, a couple of kilometers wide. We're going to talk about, major machinery to build something like that. It's interesting because the mine sites themselves are relatively small in scale to the infrastructure itself. But I would just close on that preliminary question, Mark, by saying that, this particular region where the Ring of Fire is located is very remote. And the 5 or 6 communities that are closest to it are the last 5 or 6 communities in the province that are still on diesel generation for electricity. Hard to believe.
Yes.
But we want to ensure that the communities are key partners, obviously, but also benefit from development in the region.
Yes.
And road access, I think, is, for a number of reasons, is not just about reaching prospective, no pun intended, mining sites, but also to connect communities to those resource development projects and for the benefit of better health, social, economic capacity and infrastructure moving forward.
Chief Ted Williams of the Chippewas of Rama First Nation recounts the pivotal moment, winning the Casino Rama bid and describing the leadership, strategy, and community effort that transformed their economy.
Rama, over the years, when I first was on council, we had a population of 400 people and our unemployment was 85, 90%. Those individuals who are worked in the foundry industry in Aurelia. Aurelia was a foundry town. During the summer and the winter, there was a lot of hunting and fishing. So during the course of my leadership, I was very much involved in thinking about economic development, looking at enterprises to generate money and provide for the needs of the community. We started this industrial plaza where we employed a number of members from the community in 3 or 4 different industries in the community back in 1982, 83, up until 90, 94, 95, when we started to develop the casino. We actually relocated those industries into Aurelia. So we were contributing to Aurelia's economic prosperity at that time. And so over the course of time, we took the bid and proposed to the First Nations and the provincial government to have a casino in Rama. I co-wrote the proposal. I managed all of the media, community meetings in Aurelia and area and in my community. And I visited over 100 casinos down in the States, right across the US of A, and came back and provided the information to my community first, and then the surrounding area next, and gathered support from the local municipal businesses and politicians, and that formed part of our proposal. Long story short, we were shortlisted twice, and then we actually won the bid on the 5th of December 1994, and our world changed forever after that day. Subsequently, after winning the bid, we needed to implement the development of Casino-Rama. And because I played a large role in securing the winning bid, my counsel at the time said, "Well, we need somebody to make it happen." And so they tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You've been a big part of this, so make it happen." I hired 10 people who worked with me very closely to develop the plan, working with the provincial government to make Casino-Rama happen. There was a bit of a hiccup there back in February of 96, in around this time. And but we worked and negotiated with the provincial government during that time to re-kick and restart the project. And we subsequently opened Casino-Rama on January 31st, 1996. I started as a vice president. I moved from, after I developed the casino, my job was over, and I moved into a role with the casino, and I took on the role of vice president of corporate affairs. And I don't mind telling you that the first 5 years we did the first year we did $590 million. We generated 3,400 jobs. The initial projections for Casino-Rama was that we would do 200 million and generate 1,000 jobs. Today we're doing 200 million and we've got 1,000 jobs. So basically, I've said to people that for about 26 years we rode the gravy train, and now we're at a level where we anticipated we would be 29, 30 years ago. So.
Up next is Mark Silvestre on Indigenous investment and how Indigenous communities integrate cultural values into investment policies.
Yeah, I mean, it happens, and those discussions are really becoming pretty prevalent today with newer settlements in Canada. The pressure on the elected leadership to do a per capita distribution. Sometimes a lot of these settlements are all distributed amongst the current band members. I really think there's a lot more discussion that needs to happen in terms of what you really want to do with these funds, because everybody kind of, has that need within them to say, well, I want my portion of it. Mississaugas the Credit did settle a second land claim in 2011 for the Greater Toronto area, and they distributed quite a bit out of it at that point. And then they went completely the other way. Instead of a community board of trustees, they hired a corporate trustee who really just invests the money themselves and then distributes all the revenue at the end of the year to the council, who then have some parameters around how they would invest that. But that really put a lot of pressure on the community, and they actually wanted to have a discussion about what they were going to do with our little trust. And, we were really proud of it. We've grown that $13 million trust to almost $29 million today. We funded $9 million worth of community projects. And the one, really important thing that we did, so through the work of the National Aboriginal Trust Officers Association, we connected with a group called SHARE, which is the Shareholder Association for Research and Education. And they are an advocacy group for pension funds and foundations and high net worth individuals. And they were really interested in connecting with us to bring in the Indigenous component, because what we were really realizing was that, we're investing and bringing with, hiring, quality investment managers. But unless we tell them who we are, we're investing with their values. And their values are essentially make as much money as possible with the wide universe of investments that are out there. So we could potentially be investing in companies that are doing great harm to our communities, both environmentally and culturally and rights-wise. So in the connection with Share, I'll never forget Peter Chapman, who was the executive director at the time, says, you can have that values conversation with your managers because they're already doing it for their other clients. And I said, how do you mean? He says, you don't tell me that they're telling their religious clients and faith-based pension funds to invest in defense industry or alcohol or anything like that that's completely contrary to their values. So you can have that conversation with them. And I thought that was great. That's really what I needed to know. And around 2016, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report came out in Canada on the residential schools and the impact on Indigenous communities, a lot of Canadians were, okay, well, what does that really mean? And we were, had the foresight to say, well, let's create this organization, and we've called it the Reconciliation and Responsible Investment Initiative, partnership between Share and NATOA. And for Indigenous investors, it was helping them understand the link between their cultural traditional values, the values that have managed them in their communities and managing their wealth, managing their traditions and their investment policy, because we really saw that there was a link. And we had to go and it was really a discussion about, talk amongst yourselves, your elders, your community. What are the values that run your community and manage your community? Now let's incorporate them into your investment policy so that we can share with the investment manager to show that, what goes into the portfolio is really important. What's the impact of the companies we had?
Chief Derek Epp explains how the First Nations Finance Authority is expanding access to global capital.
Yeah, the FNFA, I've been fortunate enough to be a part of the FNFA for, 5-6 years now, and was the deputy chair for the last couple of years. And now in February, I'll be stepping into the chair role as well at the First Nations Finance Authority. And that work really excites me. I think a lot of the capacity and the ability to support First Nations growth, as well as First Nations economic growth, is coming through the First Nations Finance Authority. We've surpassed over $2 billion in loans out to First Nations. And now we just did a $650 million debenture about a month ago. And we know that with the investment climate in the direction it's going, we will be looking at doing debentures of that stature more regularly. We have been accessing the global markets, but we will be needing to continue to expand that Rolodex of our investors globally to meet our demand. We know the excess amount of resource projects and renewable energy projects that will have to be done in Canada in the short future. And with the political will that we will have federally and provincially, I think the opportunity is absolutely there. And part of the FNFA, the First Nations Financial Management Board, and these institutions where I do work nationally is all about building that capacity for the First Nations, building the internal controls, accessing the capital at a competitive rate, and being able to really capitalize and be involved in these opportunities that are going to be coming, because it's not just drinking from a fire hose anymore. It's drinking from the actual fire hydrant.
Yes.
And that's what we're seeing right now. And really, we need the capital to be able to keep up with the pace and the demand, and being able to meet the economic growth needs of not only First Nations, but Canada.
Next up, we have Sean Willey, CEO of Desnetti Group, who explains how Indigenous-led businesses can drive sustainable economic growth.
Well, I wanted to give back. I had felt this entrepreneurialism in me, and I had a vision and an idea about how to, JP Gladue was head of CCAB at the time. I was one of his co-chairs. So I saw this trajectory that Indigenous business was on. I saw the court cases, but I'm also a pragmatic individual. And I said, okay, we have all these court cases. I have a very progressive First Nation who's humble, that wants to diversify and grow. How can we create a tier one business that happens to be Indigenous? And I saw this opportunity there. And if we didn't adjust things a bit, and I'm thankful for all our leaders. Like every once in a while, I'll watch a couple of the old videos of constitutional talks when you get some of those like Jim Sinclair and Mary Simon, like, and at the end they're pounding the table, and I'm appreciative of those individuals that set the table for our generation. Now we just have to sort of take it up a notch, right? And so we wanted to create a business, and so English River, use your rights and title to get that core business. So, I've been CEO at Desnetha now for 8 years. Majority of that time has been in a market downturn. And so what we did was we went out, and I've done a lot of work for corporate Canada. I know a lot of Canadian CEOs. They want to do business with Indigenous companies, but they're very honest, saying you have to match what our value proposition is at our company, right? And so we've done a good job at Desnetha, a great job at Desnetha, going out and finding companies to do mergers and acquisitions with, really indigenizing those companies, taking a 51 to 75% stake in those companies, taking advantage of the procurement opportunities in front of us. A very good compliment that we get from corporate Canada is that we're very strategically focused. We think about strategy over politics. We're not asking for a handout, we're asking for a hand up. But we're also trying to add value to everybody we're talking to.
Tiffany Eckert-Marais and Les Wilson on how Indigenous partnerships became instrumental to Yukon's economic development.
It's still pretty harrowing how there is a lot of racism still. Yukon government recently brought in the Yukon First Nation procurement policy. And so what that means is that they've amended their law that it encourages Yukon First Nation businesses to participate in the economy. And our premier has always been really forward-thinking in Yukon First Nations. And so I really am thankful for Premier Pillai. But they amended the act to encourage Yukon First Nation businesses with this procurement policy. And when we were going through that about 5 years ago, the creation of the policy, the amount of businesses that were just the terrible things they were saying, it's still, even though we're so far beyond that, we're living in an age of reconciliation, there's still a lot of fear in there. And so as we've lived the procurement policy now for a few years, it's changed the conversation from, they used to call it, there's a company called Castle Rock in Whitehorse, and it's owned by First Nation in Champagne-Ajac, Dakwakata Capital Investments. And the companies were actually saying, like, the Dakwakata effect is what they were calling the procurement policy, and they were afraid that Dakwakata was going to control every bid that government put out. But it hasn't done that. So a lot of fear mongering was happening by businesses, like non-Indigenous businesses in the Yukon. But now living in the policy, it's changed that. And there isn't the Dakwakata effect as much out there anymore. It's now working together. And I think Kwalin Dunstan and Les has worked with his development corporation that he worked for. They've done a lot of really wonderful things with partnerships and showed how they've been able to progress so far. Our First Nations, I think your First Nation signed their final agreement in 2005. 2005. We signed ours in 2002. But what Les's First Nation has been able to do with people like Les working there, they've been able to advance their First Nation tremendously. And I'm super envious of all the work that Les has done with his development corporation, because they've really embraced the spirit and intent of the procurement policy and been able to do remarkable things.
Great. Les, do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Well, I'd like to think that some of the stuff that Kwalin Dunstan's been doing and some of the progressive projects that the First Nation has, and of course its corporation, all stems from that very powerful document that's sitting right in front of Tiffany there. It's an amazing document, Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, that really speaks to me, essentially. That was Valentine's Day, 1973. I was 3 years old, right? And the children that they're talking about is me specifically, right? Wow. I am now, I would say, I suspect, a leader in the First Nation. But some of the projects that we've managed to be able to accomplish was really trying to unlock the economic potential of Kwalin Dunstan lands and essentially settlement land throughout the Yukon territory, typically in Western Canada, and I think all over Canada. Because it's Indian land or Indian dirt, it's typically a discount. It's essentially, it's not at market price. That was some of the big uphill hurdles that we've been really trying to embrace and trying to encourage the general public that there's no difference. This dirt is just the same as the other dirt. First Nation land in itself, with respect to fee simple land, it's just the same. Now, I suppose a good proxy is our gravel pit. We had a couple of gravel pits. While some of the other First Nations were arguing and negotiating for precious gems and gold, our First Nation was actually looking for gravel pits from the north and south of town. We knew even back then, long before we ratified the agreement during the negotiations, that if development was going to happen in the capital, that we were going to need dirt in order to do that. So that's what we're up to right now. That particular lease 2 and 5 in the center of Whitehorse has actually turned into a gold mine, and it's the lifeblood of our First Nation corporation to allow them to go ahead and do some of the projects that we've been very successful. And again, it's really unlocking the economic potential of Kwanlin lands.
Harold Calla shares how First Nations have transformed their economic participation through the First Nations Fiscal Management Act.
I did everything at the Squamish Nation except social services, I think. I started out as CFO. I moved into ECDEV, into treaty negotiations, and to, I think, looking at opportunities. It became very apparent that we could not achieve success until we were able to move out of some sections of the Indian Act. And that began a process of 20 years and 4 different pieces of legislation that allows First Nations on an optional basis to opt into alternatives to the Indian Act, mainly in the areas of lands and resources and economic development. And that's what I was sent away by my Squamish Council at the time that I was there to help create. The main one, of course, that we're talking about today is the First Nations Fiscal Management Act that helped create the First Nations Financial Management Board, the First Nations Finance Authority, and the First Nation Tax Commission. And these were areas that Squamish, as well as a number of other First Nations in the country, felt we needed to have some changes in the relationship with Canada around so that we could better engage in economic development on our own terms. The Financial Management Board built administrative and financial capacity in First Nation communities that they might not otherwise have. The First Nation Tax Commission supports First Nation and the exercise of fiscal powers that were gained through the legislation. And the First Nation Finance Authority emulates the BC Municipal Finance Authority in a pooled borrowing environment that allows for First Nations anywhere in Canada to access debenture financing through the Finance Authority on rates and terms similar to the province of Ontario. It's a real achievement. We now have, of the 579 Indian Act bands, we have over 380 who have opted into this legislation. They are collecting over $100 million a year now in revenues, and the Finance Authority, on request from First Nations, have accessed $3 billion, in excess of $3 billion in debt financing for them to meet their needs. So it's been a journey as we move towards gaining recognition of our inherent right to self-government in many different ways. But we very quickly realized that we needed to be able to demonstrate accountability and transparency, and we need to build capacity in First Nation communities, many of whom would only be familiar with the responsibilities related to monitoring the contribution agreements that they would receive from the federal government to deliver programs and services. Obviously, things have moved much beyond that now, moved into the mainstream of the economy. And we now need to be in a position where we can bridge almost 200 years of exclusion by bringing awareness and capacity to First Nations so they can sit across the table as legitimate and equal partners with those they want to deal with.
And finally, we have Jaimie Lickers of CIBC talking about building lasting economic strength through Indigenous investment partnerships.
I would say that the title of the team that I lead at the bank is quite intentional. It's not Indigenous relations and it's not Indigenous banking. And of course, many of our counterparts in the financial industry will have teams and leaders of things called Indigenous banking or Indigenous relations. My position as the leader of our Indigenous markets team at CIBC really reflects the primary lines of business that we operate in, which currently include commercial banking and trust management. So I lead a team of professionals across the country who are dedicated to serving the needs of our Indigenous clients in those two spaces. Mm-hmm. So our commercial banking team services, for the most part, Indigenous governments as public entities, so Indian Act bands, self-governing nations, Métis settlement councils, Inuit governments, as the public sector entities. And then, of course, we support their related entities. So as you know, many of them will have economic development corporations. They may run their own health and education authorities. And so we would service those public sector entities, as opposed to serving private clients or privately owned Indigenous business. That's outside of the work that my team does at CIBC. And then on the other side of the business, I oversee a team of trust experts that sit under our CIBC Trust Company, but service only the needs and the assets of our Indigenous trust clients. And I'm very proud to say that, to our knowledge, we now have the largest book of Indigenous trust assets under administration at CIBC, totaling somewhere between 27 and 28 billion. It changes every day. New files come in every day.
Can you explain a bit for our audience about the Indigenous trust business and what's involved in that?
Definitely. Trusts are my passion. It's where I focused my legal practice towards the end of my legal career, and a big part of the reason that I came over to CIBC. So I can talk about Indigenous trusts in my sleep. I can talk about the taxation of Indigenous trusts in my sleep, whether that's good or bad. Again, I'm still recovering from being a lawyer.
But an absolutely growing and booming business, I bet. The number of settlements and the need for expertise to manage settlement funds. As you said, new files every day, I bet.
It is. It's growing so quickly that we admittedly have a difficult time keeping up with the growth of our team and our human capital to service the demand for the services in the market. The number of claims that are being settled is just absolutely exploding. And those claims include individual claims, Rob, as you would know, at the specific claims tribunal, where one particular nation might be advancing a claim related to a breach of a treaty promise or the failure to deliver on some commitment from the Crown, and they would settle that claim on behalf of their nation alone. And those claims can easily be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But now we're also seeing two additional avenues of large-scale settlements. One is the collective advancement of treaty-based claims on behalf of the group of nations that are all signatories to a particular treaty.
So that's the best of Drumbeats 2025. 10 conversations that showed where Canadian Indigenous investment is going. The institutions are built, the capital is flowing, and the partnerships are happening at scale.
Looking ahead to 2026, the major projects pipeline is massive. Over $116 billion worth of projects already referred to the Major Projects Office. And now each one of those requires meaningful Indigenous partnership. From LNG expansion, nuclear projects, critical minerals, Canada is positioning itself as a stable supply chain alternative. And the Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit returns to London in April.
For institutional investors, project developers, and advisors listening, this is the year to get serious about how Indigenous partnership actually works in Canada. The infrastructure is operational, the opportunities are real.
What I'm looking forward to, Mark, is seeing these partnerships move from announcements to actual construction and operations. The frameworks are in place, and now it's about execution.
Thank you to our listeners and viewers for being part of this journey, and I'm so excited to be back with you, Rob, with new episodes throughout the year.
Likewise, Mark, I can't wait. It's going to be an exciting year. Happy New Year, everyone. Here's to 2026.
Here's to 2026.